All right, I see the last person settling down, and I want to give you all a very warm welcome to our second day of Unframe Festival, and a welcome to this meeting, which is called Imperialism and Profit, Class Struggles of the Global North and South. As our speaker is coming all the way from UK and is speaking in English, I will also be moderating in English. I hope you can all follow. I'll try to talk quite slowly, as well as Joseph will try, I'm sure. But it's British English, so it's very nice to listen to, I say. Yeah, I'm Zoe. I will be chairing this meeting. I'm organized with S4U, Socialism from Below, Sozialismus von Unten. And I want to give us all a few notes on how this meeting will be ran before we start. Joseph will be speaking for 30 minutes. Afterwards, you will have time for discussion, for questions, contributions, whatever you want to add to the meeting. And afterwards, Joseph will have 10 minutes to close the meeting. Joseph Choonara is a member of the Socialist Workers' Party in Britain, which is the biggest socialist organization in UK, with branches all over Britain. The struggle of the Socialist Workers' Party is rooted in the belief that problems in our society come from a system, capitalism, that prioritizes profit above all else, and the solution to that lies in a revolution where the majority of the people, the working class, take control of society and run it from the bottom up, without the billionaires, bosses, and landlords. So, the Socialist Workers' Party is also part of the IST, the International Socialist Tendency, which is a current for revolutionary socialist organization all around the globe. And, sorry, I'm going to catch my breath, I'm very excited to be talking to all of you. And Joseph Choonara is also the editor of the International Socialism Journal, the ISJ. This is the latest issue. It is a journal on socialist theory, which is published quarterly. You can have a look online at isj.org.uk, and you can also get it at our bookstores. The latest issue, as all the issues as well. Come have a look. And enough talking from my side. I'll be handing over, and please a warm welcome for Joseph Choonara.
Well, thank you. It's very, very nice to see you on this very cold day in Germany. I'm going to focus really on one aspect of the title, which is really the most important, which is to talk about the sense in which we can speak about a global class struggle and really forge a sort of working class internationalism. On what basis can we talk about class and class struggle in the modern world? And I think this is a very important topic to get right, because if you look at the public discussion of class in the media, in mainstream academic discussions and so on, you get a very weird and distorted conception of class. When you ask who the working class are, we get answers that are posed in terms of specific occupations, cultural tastes, income levels, and so on. So you get these extraordinary claims. In the case of Britain, the idea that because we don't have coal miners and necessarily as many factory workers, that the working class has disappeared. The notion simultaneously that working class people are to blame for the victory of Donald Trump and other right-wing forces around the world. Or the idea that was becoming common in recent years that anyone globally earning more than $10 a day is part of a global middle class, and therefore there are billions of middle class people in India, China, and so on. These are all extraordinarily bad starting points if we want to understand why class is a basis for transformation of society. And I want to argue that we have to go back to a classical Marxist conception of class, which is not a dogmatic conception of class, but is rooted in this notion that Karl Marx had that class was entangled with what he calls the social relations of production. And what I mean by that is you define someone in terms of their class not in terms of their income level, their cultural tastes, and so on, or a specific occupation, but you define it in terms of their relationship to other classes and their relationship to the means of production. What I mean by that is that characteristically, in any capitalist society, and the societies we see around the world today are all capitalist societies, working class people are deprived of direct access to the means of production. It is no longer true, as it had been true hundreds of years ago for the peasantry. You directly have access to the land upon which you work, the instruments of labor, and so on. If you're a working class person today, you simply don't have access to the productive forces. The people who do own and control the productive forces, the capitalist class, because they have that, they monopolize control of the means of production. As a worker, in order to gain access to the means of production and gain access to a livelihood, you enter into a relationship with a capitalist. This is the common situation of working class people on a global level. And in entering that relationship with a capitalist, usually through a wage relationship, you are simultaneously in a relationship of oppression. They control your labor power. You are exploited because you generate wealth for that person, because you characteristically generate more wealth than you receive in the form of the wage. So there's an exploitative relationship. But precisely because of that exploitation, you derive power. The working class, the ruling class, sorry, are dependent on that labor to perform the central functions that keep capitalist society running. And so that relationship is not just an oppressive and exploitative relationship, but it's a relationship that creates a class antagonism, that drives class struggle, and ultimately becomes a source of potential power for workers. And it's in this sense that Marx argues in the Communist Manifesto and elsewhere, everywhere capital grows, it creates its own gravediggers. Maybe we should say potential gravediggers, a point I'll come back to. Now, something else that Marx famously wrote in the Communist Manifesto, he ends the Communist Manifesto with this slogan, "Workers of the world unite." When he writes those words in 1848, the workers of the world constituted about 20 to 30 million people. 2 to 3% of the global population were workers. In a sense, Marx would understand a tiny minority. Today, according to the latest figures we have, there are 1.8 billion wage laborers on a global scale, 1.8 billion. That figure has gone up by a third since the year 2000, so in a quarter of a century, it has gone up by a third, from about 1.2 billion to 1.8 billion. This is a huge, historic transformation of the conditions under which people live in the capitalist world today. If we look at that figure, we're talking about something like a third of the global population of working age fit this category of wage laborers. It's actually a bigger number than the number categorized as small proprietors, small farmers, peasants, etc., etc. For the first time in world history, we can make that argument. In all kinds of ways, that data both understates and overstates the working class. It overstates it because it also includes a layer of people who have managerial functions, probably about 100 to 200 million on a global scale. But it understates it because large numbers of the 1.6 billion who are classed as small self-employed people will also some of the time undertake wage labor, or will have some sort of relationship to capital that is similar to that of wage labor. Whatever way we look at it, we're now looking at a huge surge in the number of people who are workers, who are proletarians, in the sense that Marx would have understood the concept. Now, why does this matter? It matters because class position, for Marx, imbues people with a shared set of interests and a shared set of capacities. Let's start with the interests. The interests of the working class and the interests of those who are dependent on the wage, who might not themselves be wage labourers, the children of workers, the unemployed people who aspire to be wage labourers and so on, lies in engaging in that battle to limit exploitation, but ultimately to end the system based on exploitation. This is the interest of the working class. And Marx goes further than that, and he says that through these struggles, the working class can liberate all oppressed groups. This is the distinction when Marx talks about class struggle, is that he's not to downplay the wider set of oppressions that people face, the national oppressions, sexism, racism, homophobia, etc., etc., etc. And it's not to relegate those struggles to a distant future, because Marx is very aware that all these battles have to be waged in the here and now if we're going to aim to unify the working class, to break workers off from their relationship with the ruling class and so on. These struggles are incredibly important, but the common position that workers find themselves in society means that the working class can act as a cohesive, relatively homogeneous core to these wider struggles, which can break capitalist society and aim to liberate the whole of humanity. So there's a shared and common interest here, which is the foundation for class struggle. Secondly, Marx says that that becoming a worker gives you a set of capacities. I've already talked about the capacity that working class people acquire because capital, the state, and every aspect of capitalist society depends on their labour in order to function. Therefore, by collectively withholding that labour through going on strike, occupying a factory, whatever it is, you can act against that society in powerful ways. You have this huge power as a working class. But not only that, if we look at the whole history of capitalism, again and again, the structures of capitalism impel working class people towards forms of collective struggle. And at the high points of these forms of collective struggle, because of the way that working class people are fused together, both in capitalist workplaces on a huge scale, but also in urban centres, and the world we live in today, for the first time in human history, is largely an urbanised world, with 4.4 billion humans today living in towns and cities. These forms of collective struggle form the basis for a new way of running society, for creating, through these democratic collective struggles, new organs for running society from the bottom upwards, which you see emerging in these revolutionary processes throughout the 19th, 20th, and now in the 21st century. And these collective patterns of organisation are rooted in the very fabric of capitalism. In the old peasant societies, it was possible, if you were a peasant, to rise up collectively, kill the landowner, seize the land, and each farm the land individually as a small peasant proprietor. Try doing that if you're one of thousands of workers working in a supermarket, a hospital, an airport, a factory. These individual routes to liberation no longer exist. Only collective forms of solidarity can ultimately confront capitalism. Now, this leads to a big controversy, which I want to turn to briefly, which is about the huge inequalities that exist on a global scale. It is absolutely obvious that the conditions of the working class in Germany or Britain are not the same as the conditions of the working class in Zimbabwe or Pakistan or many other countries we could look at, and what's often called inaccurately and inconveniently the global south. I'll use the terminology, although I think it conceals a huge range of differences within those societies. The point I would make about this, and I've written about this elsewhere and spoken about it both in Britain and Germany, is that although the conditions are very different, it is a huge mistake to see the relative wealth of, say, German workers as being a consequence of the relative poverty in Zimbabwe or Sri Lanka or Pakistan or somewhere else. Why do I say that? There is simply no mechanism by which the wealth pumped out of workers in Zimbabwe is directly channeled into the pockets of workers in Germany. Now, it's not true to say that the capitalist class in Germany don't benefit from exploitation elsewhere. The capitalist class, in this regard, are extraordinarily egalitarian. They will exploit labour wherever it is profitable to do so. They don't make a distinction between if you're a German worker, a Zimbabwean worker, a Sri Lankan worker, a Pakistani worker. They want to exploit your labour wherever it is convenient and profitable to do so, and enrich themselves enormously from all these kind of processes. Nonetheless, if you look at modern advanced capitalist societies, they derive most of their profits from exploitation of workers in their own country. British capital predominantly benefits from exploiting British labour, German capital from exploiting German labour. As I say, they're indifferent to where labour comes from, but in reality, this is where most of their profit-making takes place. And the reason for that is that it's in this context that they can secure the most advanced forms of labour, the most skilled, the most educated, the most healthy labour forces tend to exist in these settings, alongside infrastructure, institutions, and markets that are the most profitable for them to operate within. So they tend to direct their investment to where the investment has already taken place. There is this clustering effect of capital centred on the advanced capitalist states such as Germany, Britain, France, and so on. Now, what you see on a global scale, which is where imperialism comes into the picture, is that other ruling classes around the world try to break into this club of rich, powerful capitalist powers. Very occasionally they're successful. China is an obvious example where a country has broken through and become a major capitalist centre in its own rights. More often, they're relatively unsuccessful in doing that. Nonetheless, this is the dynamic of inter-imperialist competition which operates in this way. Now, in this context, what you see are different working classes in different conditions, but each with their own set of capacities and interests reflecting the basic relations of capitalist society. And as capitalism reproduces it on a global scale, you tend to see these patterns developing. And I want to focus really for the rest of my talk in looking at the patterns of struggles that result, both in the global south, if we're going to use that terminology, and the global north. I'll start with the global south. In the global south, the debates are often around the concept of what's called informalization, informal labour, the marginalisation of labour, and so on. The reason why this is a central debate is that the extent of urbanisation that's taken place in the global south, or in large swathes of the global south, is not matched by the creation of decently paid, formal, proletarian wage labour. I mentioned there's over 4 billion people in urban settings, but there's only short of 2 billion wage labourers, which means lots of people have been drawn into urban settings without having access to those forms of wage labour. This is one of the reasons why you get a lot of slum developments. Something like a third of the global urban population live in slums, although some of these are wage labourers, some of them are not, and so on. Not only are Are there problematic forms of development in which the rise of wage labour doesn't match the level of urbanisation? Because the rate of growth has been tepid, has been weak across many of these societies, and because you have a very, very wealthy and powerful elite in these societies, a capitalist elite that's emerged in recent decades, you find that the ability of the elite to enrich itself and defend its wealth depends more and more on the relative impoverishment of those at the bottom, which is why the pattern in many of these developing societies has been a pattern of growing inequality between the wealthy and the working class, and those who don't have access to wage labour. And this pattern of inequality, accompanied by corruption, repression and so on, has driven wave after wave of struggle in these societies. There's a wave of struggle centred on Latin America around the imposition of neoliberalism from roughly 1998 through to about 2005, 2006. There's an explosion of struggle, the Arab Spring from 2011, the after effects we're still seeing today. In 2019, there's a wave of revolutions in Algeria and Sudan, and insurrectionary struggle that takes place in Chile, in Ecuador, in Haiti, in Guinea, in Iraq, in a whole series of societies in what's called the Global South. These uprisings that have taken place are generally uprisings of the urban poor as a whole. The whole range of oppressed groups in these contexts rise up and struggle against the elite, against inequality, against corruption. At the high points of these struggle, where it leads to political change, the form that this takes is usually the election of a new government, and in the case of Latin America, if you look at the early 2000s, usually the election of a reforming, radical nationalist government. That was the case in Venezuela, in Bolivia, to some extent in Ecuador, which used in the early 2000s the enormously inflated price of commodities, of oil, of gas, and so on, to implement pro-poor reform projects, which is what you get in Venezuela and Bolivia, but to do so without encroaching on the wealth of capital. And what you see as oil prices and gas prices collapse in these societies is enormous pressure brought to bear on these governments. If we look at elsewhere, we look at the Arab Spring, when there was governmental change, you didn't even get these radical reforming governments. It's the political change that's come about as a result of these rebellions doesn't match the level of militancy. And I'll return to that point in a moment. But nonetheless, what you do see, and it points a way out of that impasse of radicalism from below but limited political change, is you see groups of workers standing at the center of these struggles. If you look at Bolivia in the early 2000s, you see this dense network of social organizations gathered around neighborhood assemblies, around working class organizations, around groups of workers who are imbued with the revolutionary syndicalist tradition that came from the country's tin mining industries and so on. If you look at the Chilean struggle in 2019, you see copper workers, you see logistics workers, you see workers in the transport system, key elements of the working class that play a central role in these struggles. And alongside these kind of groups that have a degree of power in these societies, one of the common patterns of these struggles is that you see so-called professional groups, groups of teachers, in the case of Egypt, sometimes lawyers and journalists and so on, which give a direction and cohesion to these struggles and point to a way forwards. So, even though that these are general uprisings of the urban poor, they are also struggles in which you see the working class often play a disproportionate role. And if you look at many of these societies, although it's absolutely true that formalised wage labour is probably the condition of a quarter or a third of the population, of the urban population. Nonetheless, it's far greater than the 10 or 15% of the population, urban population in 1917 in the Russian Revolution, who formed the centre of this revolutionary process. There are quite large groups of wage labourers connected in all kinds of ways to these wider rebellions of the urban poor. And these are the least favourable settings in some ways. If you look at the country that's industrialised most, if you look at China, you're now talking about a country which has created wage labour on an absolutely colossal scale. I'll just give you one example, but people talk about the Russian Revolution of 1917, centred on the city of Petrograd. Petrograd had 400,000 industrial workers in 1917 who led the revolution, who formed the centre of this revolutionary process. The Foxconn assembly plant in Shenzhen, the biggest factory complex, alone has 300,000 plus industrialised wage labourers. These are colossal centres of working class power in which really from 2007 to 2016 you saw this huge strike wave develop and surge forwards in China. Okay, so we're seeing capitalism reproduce the conditions for class struggle on a global scale. Let me talk more briefly about workers in the global north, because we have to understand this is a global process, and the workers in the global north are not irrelevant to these processes. In countries like Britain or Germany, there are intense arguments about the capacity of working class people to fight. We have not seen rebellions in these societies on that kind of scale. We've seen political struggles over issues like Palestine, and over issues like racism and so on, but you're not seeing these mass rebellions of working class on anything like the scale that we saw in Chile or Ecuador or Algeria and so on. But we have to understand that the relative stability of these societies is to some extent illusory. Capitalism is no longer in a phase where it can secure in the long term the relative affluence of working class people, where it can continue to ride out the succession of crises that it generates, ecological, economic, political, and geopolitical crises. And therefore, we have to look at the class forces as forces in a process of evolution. The great American Marxist Hal Draper talked about working class as a process of maturation through struggle. And here we have to recognize that in countries like Britain and Germany, the working class experienced huge defeats in the late 1970s and 1980s and so on, which disrupted all the bases of working class organization, followed by processes of reorganization and restructuring. These processes have not destroyed the working class, but they have reorganized the centers of power of the working class. And therefore, we have to look at both the decline of some of the old centers of working class power, but more importantly, the emergence of new centers of working class power that is beginning to take place in these societies. And I would say we're at the beginning of that process, not the end of that process at the moment. Let me very briefly talk about some of these centers of power. First of all, it is a huge mistake to write off workers in manufacturing in these countries. We've just seen in America another major strike by machinists in the Boeing plant in cities like Seattle, winning a 38% pay rise over 4 years. These are a good example of a group of workers, quite a relatively smaller group than they would have been 20 or 30 years ago, who play a central role in these expansive global production networks. And because they play a key strategic role, they can shut down the entire manufacturing network for a whole multinational firm. There's an earlier strike in Boeing back in 2008, but the data suggested that the strike was costing the country $100 million every single day because of the key structural role that workers play in this production network. Secondly, along with the decline of manufacturing, the relative decline of manufacturing, you get the growth of huge service sector industries and logistics industries and so on, which play a central profit-generating role for global capitalism. I think in Britain about the Amazon warehouses that are springing up all over the country, usually in former manufacturing areas that represent concentrations of both investment, but also thousands upon thousands of workers who are collectivized and are beginning to organize. We had the first union drive in Amazon, the first strikes in Amazon in the last 2 or 3 years in Britain. And alongside this, you get the same patterns in the global south of formally professionalized groups who are facing all the indignities and pressures of working class life. I work in a university. My union, the University and College Union, has engaged in more strikes in the last 10 years than any other group of workers in Britain. In other words, we're the cutting edge. We're the vanguard of the working class, ridiculously. But why is that coming about? Well, we get emails from management every week now saying we are monitoring your performance. What are your research outputs? How many students are you teaching? What are the students saying about your teaching? All of the forms of monitoring, control, all of the indignities of working class life are now experienced by university lecturers, doctors, nurses, paramedics, civil service workers, and so on. If you look at the big strike wave in Britain in 2022, 2023, these were often the most dynamic militant groups within those struggles. So again, you see these networks of working class resistance at the center of wider rebellions. Okay. Let me just finish then, because I'm running out of time, by saying this. The picture I've painted is one of enormous working class potential, but it's only working class potential. We can say with confidence that the conditions of the working class will impel these groups into struggle. That's something that I'm confident will happen as a historical hypothesis because it's happened throughout the entire history of capitalism, that new groups of workers have been forged and forced to fight collectively. What we can't take for granted is the politics. And here we have to say that our role as people who want to transform the world is to look to, is to nurture, is to unify and build solidarity among these emerging struggles, to identify the new forces that are developing. We cannot predict with certainty or dictate the tempo under which those struggles will develop. That will be dictated by much wider social forces. But we can ensure that there is a socialist politics at the center of these struggles that can ensure that they take up these wider issues of oppression that can divide the working class, to unify those struggles, to form these networks of solidarity and allow these struggles to break through, to win, and to ultimately confront these oppressive and exploitative structures of capitalism, and one day to break them through workers' resistance.
Thank you, Joseph, for this very great talk. We will now have the chance for coming to talk with each other a bit. You have the chance of asking questions. I will ask you to raise your hands, and please be patient because I might not be picking you in the order you're raising your hands. I will be prioritizing first-time speakers and Flinter persons. I don't want to assume your gender, so if you identify as a Flinter person, please raise your hand as so. This is no coincidence. And otherwise, just raise your hand like so. You will have 3 minutes max to speak. You can fill out those 3 minutes, but you don't have to. And I really want to encourage comprehension questions, easy questions, yeah, whatever comes to your mind. We are recording this meeting, so I will ask you to come to the front and speak. If you don't want to appear on the video, you can just come to the side and you will be handed a microphone. Otherwise, it would be nice to also see you in our recording, of course, so if you want, you can also step up to the front. Yes. I barely see it. Can you turn on the lights a bit, maybe? Yeah, nice. I can barely see you, but you're raising your hand. Yeah, please.
Do I yell?
Yes, I'm talking to you. Yes.
Do I yell?
If you can come to the front, that would be amazing. And you'll be handed a microphone.
Yeah, if you're standing here, you will be in the video. So if you don't want to be in the video, you can stand here.
Hi, thank you. I was listening at the beginning, you were talking about there being no mechanism for why wages in the global north are higher due to lower wages in the global south. That surprised me a little bit. Or maybe there are some mechanisms, for example, that cheap labor in the south allows lower wages in the north to be then continued because there's a feeling of a higher consumption power with the lower wages that you have or stagnating wages. I thought it'd be nice if you could elaborate on that because I found that interesting. And the second part I had was later on you did talk about global production networks. So I'm really interested in those, and there's some stuff that I was reading about this too. And I think a question for me came from then in this, if workers of the world unite, how does that look? Are there spaces that you've seen or ways you imagine this happening through global networks, global production networks, where it's maybe not the Boeing manufacturers or the workers in the US at the top of the value chain that then cause a disruption, but something solidarity along the value chains? I'd be curious to hear about that as well. Thank you.
Thank you. In the very back, you're raising your hand if you want to come to the front. And another encouraging moment for you to please be reminded, please ask any questions that come up. There's no wrong questions. We're all going to benefit from what you're asking yourself right now.
Yeah, so if I understood right, earlier on in the talk you mentioned that there's that the working class here, for example, in Germany, does not benefit from the exploitation of the working class in the global south. So this makes me wonder, like for me, mechanisms in which they benefit is kind of the prices of products, of coffee, the cheap coffee they can have here, the cheap tomatoes they can have here, the cheap clothes that are manufactured in Bangladesh, even the holidays that they have, for example, in Southeast Asia. Yeah, how come they don't fit as a benefit from the exploitation? Yeah.
Thank you. Phil, you were raising your hand.
Hi, thanks, Joseph. A question, could you say something about the relationship between individual campaigns and class struggle, worker struggle? Because we had the situation in the last few years with, say, Fridays for Future, where they got a demoralisation of kids who had been demonstrating every week for 2.5 years, and they were ignored. And I think something similar is starting to happen in part of the Palestine movement, where we demonstrate, they ignore us. At the same time, you do see some things like the recent example of Barcelona dock workers who said, we are not sending weapons to Israel, which in a sense had a bigger impact on than a lot of demonstrations. And even in Germany, with the relatively low level of Palestine movement, we've got groups of social workers, group of health workers who are coming together, not on the basis of demos, but on where they work. And there's a big difference here, because if you go on a demo, that's self-selecting. So if you're anti-racist, you go on an anti-racist demo. If you're against genocide, you go on an anti-genocide demo. If you start organising workplaces, then everybody has got to say, I'm either for it or against it. It confronts people to take a side. So that's the background to the question, which is, on the one hand, there's campaigns which are necessary but don't have direct impact on capitalism. On the other hand, there's workplace campaigns which are sometimes shorter. Now, what's the connection between the two?
Thank you. Any more questions? Yeah, amazing. Please come to the front. And I have you as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for a super interesting lecture. I will try to put it into one question, but it might end up in two, and I will stick to the 3 minutes. The first question is, of course, you mentioned the Russian Revolution, which is one of the examples of like workers uniting and something happening, like a major change, social, political, cultural. But the way that the Soviet Union was structured, I mean, firstly, it was a colonial project, and it fed off insane amounts of oppression, violence, also of the working class in the end. So my question to you is that, because we have yet to see in history, like, good examples, healthy examples, non-violent examples, examples of non-oppression, oppression, of communism actually working in practice, and like workers uniting and workers creating a revolution that ends up in the benefit of the workers. So I just wanted to hear your reflections on that. And then the second question is, which I did not implement in the first, is that you mentioned that, of course, the workers have power if they unite, and in theory, they can overthrow, for instance, let's say, the rulers of factories, which is, of course, you mentioned is difficult today when we look at hospitals, stuff like that. But this power is, in practice, enormously limited, because even if the workers unite, they might just end up losing their jobs, and then someone else will get hired, and then they will have no food to eat. So this power, I think, is also over-exaggerated, not just today, but also has been historically. So also, please, a reflection on that. Thank you.
Thank you. You were raising your hand on the left. Yes.
Thank you for your lecture. I have a twofold question about the role of China and the working class in China you mentioned. You mentioned that China is one of the countries that sort of broke into the capitalist core, which I wonder, do you see the good thing or bad thing in the global struggle against capitalist system? Because on one hand, of course, I think I also read a study somewhere that because based on the current colonial structure, like the capital transfer from the global north to the south is through, for example, the cheap labors, and also the other person asked the question that it's still sort of exploitation, even though the working class from the global north didn't benefit directly, but because through this structure, capital transfer from the north to the south is still happening. But then China is one of the countries that reversed this trend. But at the same time, it is still a authoritarian country, and it still implemented a very heavy, arguably even more stronger state capitalism that even reshaped the current state of capitalism. So I'm just curious that what do you see the role of China? And the other question is, you mentioned China for sure has probably one of the biggest working class worldwide. At the same time, they are heavily oppressed, arguably even more so than most of the countries in the West. They don't have a workers' union, for example. So how do you suggest to leverage actually this portion of working class?
Thank you. Another speaker here, and you after that. And while you're speaking, you can still raise your hand. After that, I sadly have to close already because we're a bit running behind the clock. Please, thank you.
It goes to actually many of the last questions. I came late, so maybe you already touched upon it. Thanks for the lecture. I'm from Peru. In Chile, there is, socialism became realpolitik, and they failed. And And we actually, in Peru, we don't have a political class. It's just corruption, like the right kind. I mean, from the right. We also had it from the left, but you know. So like, and then I wonder, so I've been living here for 10 years. The other day I was talking to a worker, a real worker, and she was, and we were talking about how we should be on the streets and we're not. And I always say my logic is like, well, there's this like little piece of social welfare state still, so people, you know, hang on to that and don't go on the streets. So, yeah, how does that, like, what sense do you make of it? And then also, because people keep saying, like, okay, the power of the working class, blah, 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 blah. But I feel that, I mean, not blah, 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 you know. Sorry. I feel that, like, there's some sort of, like, psychoanalysis missing, like, because desire is not named, like, you know, sort of like, we think that, oh, we're goodies because we're leftists, and we know, I mean, if we want to know, we know that leftism or leftist politics has also gone really wrong. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I mean, please. Sorry, before you start, I just heard that the next meeting will only start at 12:30. I don't want to go until 12:30, but we have a bit of time. So if you have any questions left, please raise your hand in the next minute so I can still give you the time. And after that, we'll head over to Joseph.
Yeah, I don't have a question. I want to make a comment. And it is about a question that was asked earlier, that there is no historical experience of socialism. And this is not true. There was one successful revolution. Before Stalinism, there was, in what is today Russia, a revolution, and they had for 4 years a socialist society. It was totally different structured than capitalism. For example, reproductive work that in capitalism usually women of Flinta do was carried by the society. They had public children nurseries, and they also had restaurants where everyone can eat, so that women don't have to cook and don't have to watch for the kids, but everyone did it. And they were Bolsheviki to, like, instead of the party system we have today, they were a little Bolsheviki and stuff. So, but the thing is, and by the way, there was also a strong socialist movement in Germany with Clara Zetkin, Rosa Luxemburg, and Karl Liebknecht, who were murdered. And the SPD played today, the Social Democratic Party in Germany, they played a big role in the murder of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. So, but the thing is, I grew up in Germany, I went to school here, and we totally do not learn about this, and we learn another version. Yeah, and I know these things because I'm a socialist. I'm also a member of Socialism from Below, Sozialismus von unten. And this is another thing. Real socialism can only emerge from below. The people, the workers have to carry it. And if you look at Stalinism or the DDR, GDR in English, I think, this was not real socialism because it came from above. And this we call state capitalism. And it's, yeah, people always think that this was socialism and it failed, but it is not actually socialism.
Thank you. I see one last contribution. Yes, please.
Yeah, hi, I'm Mazia, also from Socialismus von unten. I wanted to mention, of course, I think the people in global, of course, the working class people here in North, they have a T-shirt, cheap T-shirt from Bangladesh. But if we are talking about working class, I think it is not a moralic argument. It is not a community. It is also, but if we are talking about capitalism, we are talking about the dynamics. And Rosa Luxemburg said the change should be break where they are forged or produced, and this dynamic, global dynamic, help us. We have to break capitalism wherever we can, and we have to make this solidarity between and the working class. If we can manage to bring the working people, who are now a lot of them in the surveys are pro-Palestine or against this genocide, if we can break them, they can break in Germany. And if it is a solidarity with the Global South, the people in Global South, the working class, it is not an accident that the capitalists have a meeting together because they want to organize the global exploitation, because they want to organize this chain thing. But the working class should also, this is our chance. It is the way, I think.
Thank you. All right. I sadly have to be closing the discussion round for now. Before I hand over to Joseph, I want to say a few organizational things. First of all, it's very nice that we're all coming together here and that we're discussing revolutionary ideas, but every theory needs a praxis, and we need every single one on the streets right now. We have the AFD, the fascist AFD on the rise. We have a genocide still happening in Gaza and in Palestine and the West Bank. And I would just wanted to urge you to, if you're interested in helping building this movement, that you should think about joining, for example, Aufstieg gegen Rassismus or the Gaza Committee, or even become organized at, for example, Socialism from Below. I for sure have not regretted it, and I'm very thankful, and I think it's my realization of the year that the most important thing is to not be alone in this kind of times. So yeah, a warm recommendation. There will be bookstores by S4U, Socialism from Below, the Gaza Committee, and Aufstieg gegen Rassismus. You can have a look, you can have a chat, you can leave your contact details, and we will contact you, and you can get involved, get signatures for the petition against weapon deliveries to Israel, etc., etc. Also, there's a list in front. I will be laying it out here, which is the petition where you can sign directly, or you can do it downstairs. Also, I want to advertise the ISJ again, which I just read the article on Sudan yesterday evening, and I thought it was brilliant. I can really recommend buying it or looking it up online. Joseph Choonara has written books. One of them is Kapitalismus entschlüsseln, which is an economist theory on Marxism, a Marxist theory on economy, this way. And we have a book on Imperialism by Chris Harman, who's also a member of who was a member of the Socialist Workers' Party in Britain. Also a warm recommendation. You can get it all downstairs. Much talking. So I think that's all I wanted to say. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you for your contributions. I hope you enjoy the rest of Unframe Festival. And I'll hand over to Joseph for the last 10 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you for the questions. If I don't answer your question, come and grab me afterwards, because I've got limited time. But let me start with one of the big challenges to what I'm saying, because I would insist that the relationship between North and South should not be seen primarily as a relationship of exploitation by the North of the South. What I mean by that is that the old tradition of dependency theory within economics is for me a dead end. Because what it neglects, and characteristically always neglects this, is that when you're talking about capitalist mechanisms, relationships of exploitation are always relationships between classes, wherever they are. Now, that doesn't mean that German capitalists can't exploit people in the global South, but it means that Germany as a nation isn't exploiting global South nations. German capitalists might be exploiting people elsewhere, but not Germany as a homogeneous, unified state. And that's very important because it underpins the possibility of international solidarity among workers. Without that insight, you can't really defend those forms of international solidarity. Now, of course, it's absolutely true that wages are held down in the global South. It's part of the dynamic of how an uneven capitalist development takes place, that to be a successful capitalist in the global south often involves holding down wages at very, very low levels. That's absolutely true. And it's absolutely true that this might depress the price of commodities. But it's also true that productivity rises in the global north depress the price of commodities. It doesn't automatically mean that workers get richer and richer every year in the global north, because there's a battle in which the capitalists in the global north will, in relative terms, try to hold wage levels down. And therefore, if you're going to benefit from a greater capacity to earn more, you still have to wage class struggle in the global north. It's not like the capitalists come to you every day and say, oh, we've made loads of money from exploiting people in Botswana or Sri Lanka today. Here's an extra 1,000 euros in your pay packet. Of course not. Of course it doesn't work that way. So we have to look at the shared conditions of exploitation that bind together workers in the global north and workers in the global south, and the shared patterns of exploitation which now capitalists in the global south are very much part of, because there is a super rich capitalist elite in these global south capitalisms that are also exploiting workers and are part of this process. So that's what I'd say. We have to see exploitation always as a relationship between classes upon which class power and solidarity is founded. Secondly, someone talked about Russia. I agree very much with the person who spoke from the floor and talked about Russia after the late 1920s as a state capitalist society. Now, what I mean by that is I defend the 1917 revolution in Russia. I see it as an explosion of liberation. I see it as creating the conditions, the potential for a socialist world, but only as part of an international wave of revolutions that break capitalism where it's most powerful. The whole logic of the 1917 revolution was premised on revolutions spreading to Europe, Western Europe, and in particular, Germany. And it's the failure of the German Revolution from 1918 to 1923 that condemns the Russian Revolution to isolation, that allows the various capitalist powers to invade Russia, which allows the civil war to go so horribly for Russia, which decimates the Russian working class and creates the conditions for Stalinist counter-revolution, which establishes a state capitalist society, which sees its goals exploiting workers in order to build up an industrial base and compete with the Western powers. And therefore, state capitalist Russia from 1928 joins this process of inter-imperialist competition as a capitalist power, dominated by the state bureaucracy and not free market capitalism. So we have to understand both the liberatory potential of 1917, but also the nature of that counter-revolution and why we shouldn't look to Stalinism as any kind of democratic alternative to capitalism. That brings me to the question of China. Someone asked whether China's rise is a good thing. I identified China after 1949 as precisely a variant of state capitalism after the 1949 revolution. That model of state capitalism ran into its own barriers by the late 1970s and the 1980s. The degree of globalization and internationalization of capitalism put massive pressure on that state capitalist model. In the Soviet Union, it collapsed. In China, they learnt from the failures of the Soviet Union, and they opened up to the global market and created this much more hybrid form of capitalism, combining state capitalism and free market capitalism, largely directed towards the export economy in China. And it's on the back of that that China experienced this huge capitalist boom in the, particularly in the 90s and early 2000s, which again is beginning to falter now. But for 15, 20 years, extraordinary rates of growth and investment in China. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't think it, in and of itself, it creates I don't think China is in any sense a socialist society, let me put it that way. China is a capitalist society, and China has now joined the club of major imperialist powers. It engages in inter-imperialist competition with America, with European powers, and so on. It's part of that world of conflict, competition, and so on. The one positive element is that in potential, it has created a huge force of proletarians, of wage labourers in China who can potentially break those structures of capitalism and join in as part of that international wave of struggles. So like capitalist development anywhere, the capitalist development of China creates its own gravediggers. It creates the potential for a socialist society, but to realise that potential, that working class have to act, have to fight, and have to discover forms of socialist politics which can lead them to a confrontation with their own state and ruling class. So in that sense, the rise of China as a capitalist power creates potential. Two final points I want to make by way of conclusion. It's very interesting when you have these discussions about class, you always get people getting up and saying, but the working class are too powerless, we'll all be sacked if we fight, and so on. And then you also get people standing up and saying, but the working class are too wealthy, too privileged, too affluent, so they'll never fight. And the problem is that these arguments have been going on for several hundred years now. I can find people in Britain in the 1860s, 1870s in Britain who said, the working class now, it's not like it used to be in the 1840s. They're not really fighting because they're too wealthy now. The same argument in the 1950s in Britain. Or I can find people in the 1880s and 1890s saying the working class are too poor, if they fight they'll lose their jobs, they're too downtrodden and so on. The problem is that the reality of working class life impels you towards struggle. Marx wrote beautifully about this in the 1840s. He says, it's not what this or that working class people think. It's about what the working class is and what, because of what it is, it will be forced to do. It's a logic of capitalism that forces workers to fight, and it's a logic of capitalism that imbues workers with collective power. And that collective power still exists, even if the working class are not fighting. And they're not always fighting, as we know. Let me just make one final point to finish, which is about the question that Phil asked about the relationship between these kind of social movements that erupt over climate change or Palestine and so on, and working class struggle. I think we have to say, if we want to build working class unity, you need to have a socialist politics that says we take up every instance of oppression. Every instance of oppression. Because any form of oppression does two things. You take racism, sexism, homophobia, whatever you want to talk about. Number one, it divides the working class. Number two, it binds a section of the working class to the ruling class. That's a function of nationalism, of racism. It's to say that you as a worker have more in common with your prime minister or your capitalist than you have in common with black workers, Muslim workers, and what have you. So we have to have a politics within the working class that takes these things up. But it also has to connect those forms of oppression to a wider structural system of capitalist oppression and exploitation, and it has to link it to working class struggle. I'll give you a little example. The university where I work, I help to run the union branch. My students occupied the university. Shamefully, the university called in the police, arrested a number of those students. This happened last weekend. What do we do as a trade union? Do we say, oh no, we only care about wages. We only care about our conditions in the workplace? No. We came together, we put out within hours of that a statement that said our students stand in the finest tradition of the occupations of 1968, of the occupations against apartheid South Africa. they're on the right side of history, and our university has links to corporations that are sponsoring genocide in Palestine. We put that argument out and we linked their struggle against oppression to a struggle within the working class. That's what we have to do. We have to do that because it's through working class struggle that these battles over politics, over oppression and so on, can gain a cohesiveness, a continuity, a power that can ultimately allow them to break through and smash these kind of structures. So it's not a question of whether we do social campaigns, political campaigns, or working class campaigns. We have to make the connections, and we have to say that ultimately our liberation depends on working class people rising up collectively and breaking the centres, the structures of capitalist power. That's our tradition. Thank you.